think we will get started, and I will just begin with a brief introduction of Rabbanit Leah Sarna, who will say I'm a longtime fan and admirer of your Torah. And first off, by wishing you a Mazal Tov on your recent appointment as spiritual leader of your community in Philly. So here's a little bit about you, which is a little because you do a lot. The Rabbanit Leah Sarna is a member of the faculty and director of teen programs at Drisha. She previously served as director of religious engagement at Anshe Shalom, B'nai Israel congregation in Chicago, a leading urban Orthodox congregation. She was ordained at Yeshivat Maharad in 2018, holds a BA from Yale University in philosophy and psychology, and also trained at the SKA Beit Midrash for Women at Migdal Oz, Drisha, and the Center for Modern Torah Leadership. She has been awarded the Pomegranate Prize in Jewish Education by the Covenant Foundation and was a Wexner Graduate Fellow. Rabbanit Sarna's published works have appeared in The Atlantic, The Washington Post, Lair House, and the Jewish Review of Books. She has lectured in Orthodox synagogues and Jewish communal settings around the world and loves spreading her warm, energetic love for Torah and mitzvot with Jews in all stages of life, and currently serves as the spiritual leader of Kilat Shari Olam in Philadelphia. Sorry, one quick reminder as well. Closed captioning and ASL is available. Closed captioning by clicking the captions button at the bottom and ASL by clicking the little globe interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. And with that, I will turn it over to Rabbanit Leah Sarna.
Hi everyone. It's so wonderful that you're all awake at this time and learning Torah. I saw someone log on who has just learned an hour and a half of Torah with me in Philly and is now here. So hi Lisa, and amazing that you're back for more. I'm really excited to be learning with you all tonight. I do want to begin with sort of two notes or warnings. The first is mundane, which is that this is my second time ever teaching with ASL interpretation and closed captioning, and I normally speak really fast, and I know that that does not make my delivery as accessible as it should be, and I'm going to be trying to tone it down tonight to the best of my abilities, but I also want to empower Rabbi Mark to be like, hey, slow down. And it just doesn't come naturally to me, and I'm really trying, and I could use your help. So that's a dynamic that's going on here. And it's so wonderful, of course, that YCT makes these talks accessible. It's really such a model for all of us, and such a dream world that you all are building. So thank you for that. The second thing I want to say is like a little bit more serious, and that with that, I'm going to transition into the Torah part of this, which is that we're going to be talking about some really like dark, heavy things in this talk. So this is like just a trigger warning for violence and for sexual violence. And the reason that we're talking about that is that this year it feels more important than ever to recognize that in times of oppression, women experience that oppression differently. Women's bodies are just vulnerable in different ways than men's bodies are, and particularly in worlds and cultures which Judaism historically participated in to a very great degree and really continues to participate in, where you have this idea that women can be defiled and that women's worth is in some ways tied up with virginity, monogamy, other people not having penetrated you, to just be really explicit, that really sort of raises the bar on the type of vulnerability that women face in times of oppression. So if people can mute, that would be so great. What that means today is that we all think about, and with just like my heart cries constantly for all of the hostages, of course, but for the remaining female hostages in particular, and those that have returned home have told us in no uncertain terms things that we already knew about what those women are surely facing. And so to me, what that meant going into Pesach this year was like, we actually have to ask ourselves, what was the female experience like in Egypt? Which we don't normally ask, right? Like you go through the Seder night and you talk about one unified experience of slavery, And then when we are mentioning women, we're mentioning women as having lots and lots of children, right? Paru, v'yishritzu, v'yirbu, v'ma'od, v'od, right? That they just had lots and lots. They multiplied like it's like insect language, multiplied like insects, and they filled the land, and that's how you had this strong, large group of Jews ready to leave Egypt eventually. But we don't talk about like the slavery itself. What was it like? But I want to argue tonight that our text itself, our Torah text itself, contains some really strong hints as to what that experience was, if only we keep our eyes open to read for them. The Hagadah contains a clear opening for it, and Midrashim that maybe we're not so familiar with start to spell some things out pretty explicitly about what that experience was like. And at the end of this, my conclusion is actually that what our sisters in Gaza are experiencing is worse than what women experienced in Egypt. But we can remember that there's a line to be drawn directly between our oppressors and their hopes, even if they're and their hopes and their plans for Jewish women in Egypt all the way through to today. So that's what we're going to be doing today, in not very much time. So there's more evidence than what I'll be presenting to you tonight. And also I'm going to like have this big smile because that's just what I do when I teach, but I don't really mean it. So don't read too much into my facial expressions. And okay. That's it. We're starting now. All right, source one. So the first thing, we're going to look at three different elements of what women, female slaves in Egypt experience. So the first thing is just this crushing, forced labor. We have this description in Exodus 1, verses 13 and 14 about just what it looked like for everyone, right? The Egyptians ruthlessly imposed upon the Israelites the various labors that they made them perform. They made their lives bitter with hard work, with mortar and with bricks, and with all sorts of tasks in the field. And we have that same word again, all the work that they imposed upon them ruthlessly. So we have this befarech, right? This sort of orientation or whatever it is, this ruthlessness, that's how they're translating it. But the Midrash says what is the farech and brings a whole bunch of different explanations for what it could be, and only one of them has to do with gender. So that's the one I'm bringing here. So Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachman says the name of Rabbi Yonatan Milamid Shahayu Machlifim Malachet Anashim Lanashim. It teaches that they would exchange the labor of men for women, Umalachet Nashim LeAnashim, and the labor of women for men. And then Rabbi Avia says, yes, Rabbi Elazar would concede that this work is in fact crushing. This is a cruel way of making people work, making people do work that's outside of their specialty, outside of their expertise, that takes women outside of their homes and outside of their families to do this kind of crushing field work that they weren't used to doing, that's just where we're getting started. So we're getting started with women when we right. I mentioned before that we have this sort of starting feeling that like, oh, women and men had the same experience of slavery with the crushing work. And here's where we're really seeing that spelled out. Like, yes, women were doing crushing work in Egypt. Okay, next thing. We're not going to read all of this, but the first thing I want to argue is that wet nursing is a type of slavery and that was mobilized by the Egyptians. So the first thing that we see in Exodus 1 is this idea that all the boys should be killed and the girls should live, and the midwives are supposed to accomplish this. They're supposed to just kill the boys immediately, but the midwives didn't do that. And so then Paro eventually says, okay, forget the midwives. We're going to kill all the boys and we're going to keep all the girls alive. So like, where did Paro get this idea from, right? It sounds so crazy. Why are you keeping the girls alive, right? But if you know anything about dairy farming, then actually this is a really normal idea. So this is just from an article about dairy farming in the New York Times. Dairy cows are repeatedly impregnated by artificial insemination and have their newborns taken away at birth. And why, like, and if the newborns are taken away at birth, then like, why are you inseminating them, right? What's the point? Just tell it, make it so that they can't have children at all, right? If they're gonna have children, like, why even have children? But the point is that actually, why do you impregnate dairy cows? It's so that you can have their milk. And then you take the babies away, you let the female calves live. Why? Because female calves will in the future be dairy cows, right? So female calves are confined to individual pens, have their horn buds destroyed when they're about 8 weeks old. The males are not so lucky. Soon after birth, they're trucked off to veal farms or cattle ranches where they end up as hamburger meat. So the males, right, dairy farming, males die, baby girls are kept alive for their future milk production potential, and moms are repeatedly impregnated for their continued ability to produce milk. So what I want to argue is that this concept, right, where did Pharaoh even get the idea of kill the boys, keep the girls? Animal husbandry. So first of all, you're treating the Israelites like animals, but second of all, you're creating, right? What's the work of those animals? The work of those animals is wet nursing, and we know that Israelites were wet nurses for Egyptian women because the Torah tells us explicitly, right? We have the birth of Moshe. Moshe gets put into the Nile. An Egyptian woman, i.e., Bat Paro, Pharaoh's daughter, adopts this child. And then Miriam is standing there. And the first thing, right, the minute after Bat Paro decides that she's going to adopt him, Vatomer Achuto El Bat Paro, the sister of the baby, says to Bat Paro, Ha'ilech v'karati lach isha meineket mina ivriot, should I go and find you a wet nurse from amongst the Israelites, Vatinik lach et who will nurse the baby for you, right? It's not even like we have the Midrash imagines, a pretty famous Midrash imagines that Moshe, that Bat Paro tried to get Moshe to nurse from an Egyptian midwife. But that is not the plain meaning of the text. Meaning the plain meaning of the text is Miriam sees Bat Paro taking Moshe in. She steps out from her hiding place and says, I know what you need. You, like every other Egyptian mom today, are looking for an Israelite wet nurse. Let me go find you. I know just the best person. And thereby, what Miriam does is reunites Moshe with his mother, whereas maybe otherwise he would have been wet nursed by some random Jewish Israelite woman instead of his actual mother, instead of Yocheved. But the idea that Bat Paro doesn't blink before taking on an Israelite wet nurse tells us something about what the norm was. And the norm was, it seems, from the simple read of the Psukim, the norm was Israelite women were being raised almost as wet nurses, and the Egyptian women who had babies gave those babies to Israelite women to nurse as a form of forced labor with their bodies. Okay. And just in case you think, wow, that's so crazy, wet nursing as a form of slavery happened in the United States. And we have first person accounts of it. And I'm not gonna like go so deeply into this. Obviously, this stuff is really, really horrible. I mentioned at the beginning that a lot of the material we would be looking at is horrible. This stuff is horrible. And here, right, so this is a woman, a freed slave talking about her mother. My mother would have a baby every time my mistress would have one, so that my mother was always the wet nurse for my mistress. So this is not exactly the same, meaning the baby wasn't killed in this instance, Rabbanit Leah Sarna, but it's the same idea of a slave owner controlling the fertility, we're going to come back to this in a second, controlling the fertility of their slaves so as for the enslaved women to be available as wet nurses. Okay? Okay. Okay, so now we're moving on to the hardest part of it, which is that I want to argue in this next portion that there was an attempt at the creation of sex slavery, and that what we're going to see is that, at least according to the Midrash, and it gets backed up by texts which are a little bit too complicated for us to go into tonight, at least according to the Midrash, the sex slavery attempts were successfully rebuffed by the Israelite women. So here's where we don't see that rebuffing, right? We don't see it. Here's the Hagadah. This is in the Arami Ovidavi section of the Hagadah. So we're taking verses from the first fruits declaration and kind of breaking them up into parts and adding drashot onto each word, adding expansions and interpretations onto each word of the first fruits declaration. So the first fruits declaration says Vayishma Hashem et Kolinu, and then right, the Lord heard our voice, and then it's going to attach it to a verse in Exodus 2. Vayishma Elokim et Na'akatam, God heard their groans. Vayskor Elohim et Brito et Abraham Yitzchak Yaakov, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Vayaret Oninu, he saw our affliction. What is our affliction? Zo prishut derech eretz. This is the separation from the way of the world. Kamosha Amar, as it says, and it's going to attach it again to the next verse in Exodus. Vayar Elokim et bnei Israel, vayeda Elokim. And God saw the children of Israel, and God knew. Okay, so what are we talking about? I actually have a childhood memory, just to lighten it up for one quick second. I have a childhood memory of asking my synagogue rabbi, what is this? And him kind of like turning purple and telling me to talk to my parents. But what is this, right? So prishut derech eretz, separation from the way of the world. What we understand that to mean is husbands and wives not being allowed to be intimate together. And where do we get that from? God saw the children of Israel and God knew. So this lada'at, this knowing, is often a way that the Torah describes sex. So it's God knowing about the lack of ability for husbands and wives to be together. And now, why would you separate husbands and wives, particularly if you actually have a vested interest in the women becoming pregnant so that they can wet nurse your children, right? Like, why would you actually separate the husbands and wives if you anyways just plan to kill the children? And you might say, oh, we'll separate the husbands and wives so that they don't have children, so that we don't have to kill them. But then why are you letting the girls live at all? Clearly you want there to be moms who are lactating, and clearly you want there to be girls. So what's the point of separating husbands and wives? I think it's to make those wives sexually available to Egyptian men. That's my argument, that that's at least the plan or the thought or the assumption that the Hagadah is winking at. The Hagadah does seem to, in some ways, recognize itself as like a family-friendly text. There's very little sort of sex in the Hagadah in general. I think that's what's happening here. And the Midrash talks about it very briefly in Shemot Rabbah 1:18. It says, Kol bat techayun, right? Every daughter you shall keep alive. Ma tzorech leFaro lekayim hanekivot. Why did Pharaoh need to keep the females alive? Elakach hayu omrim. This is what they said. Namit hazcharim. We will kill the males. V'nikach hanekivot lenashim. And we will take the females as wives. Lefi shahayu hamitzrim shtufim bezima, because the Egyptians were engulfed with lewdness. The dream is for the Jewish people to be only mothers and daughters available sexually to the Egyptian men. Okay, that's the plan, right? The plan is these women are going to work hard. They're going to have babies. We will kill the male babies. Mothers will then be available as wet nurses. And we're going to separate them from their husbands. And they're still going to somehow have babies. Where are those babies going to come from? Egyptian men. Okay, that seems to be the plan, the vision for Jewish women, for Israelite women in Egypt. But what happens? It doesn't work. It doesn't work because even though the Midrash describes, right, even though they sent the men out of the homes and the men were working so hard that they slept in the fields and they were so degraded by the work that maybe they couldn't even imagine having sex with their wives. And maybe the husbands, the Midrash imagines that the husbands purposefully separated from their wives so that they wouldn't have children. And then actually Miriam potentially says to her father, like, no, what? So like we won't even have girls in our people anymore, right? With the background I just laid out to you, how much eerier is that, right? That the men are saying to themselves, like they're setting up our wives to be raped and our daughters to be raped. Like, let's just not have them. And the women are saying, it's the women intervening and saying, no, we can manage this. No, we can fight this. No, we can fight this. And pushing their parents, right? Miriam, the Midrash describes Miriam pushes her parents to get back together, and everyone else then got back together with their wives, and they kept having children. And okay. So right, and this Midrash describes some of that, and I'm trying to keep an eye on the time here, otherwise we would be reading this. But so Rabbi Akiva sort of famously says, and sometimes this line appears in the mouths of other people, Darash Rabbi Akiva, Bischar Nashim Tzikaniot Shayu Boto Ador Nigalu Yisrael Mitzrayim, on account of the righteous women who were in that generation, Egypt was redeemed from, Israel was redeemed from Egypt. And so what did they do? When they would go and draw water, HaKadosh Baruch Hu mezamin lahem dagim ktanim b'chadeihem v'shoavim machza mayim u'machza dagim. When they would go to draw water, God would put fish into their jugs, and they would draw water, and the water would be half water and half fish. And then they would go to their husbands and they would show them, they would place two pots on the fire, one with hot water and one with fish, and they would bathe their husbands and they would feed them and they would anoint them with oil and they would give them to drink and they would consort with them between these two pots. So these women, not only do we have this image of the Egyptians were filled with lewdness and they're coming after these women and like that is their plan, and then we have the separate image. Image number one, that. Image number two, these women seeking out their husbands and saying, no, I refuse. I refuse to have my sex life be with Egyptians. You're going to get ready for me. You're going to be energized enough to do this. You're going to feel clean. You're going to feel dignified. You're going to feel beautiful enough to do this. And we are going to make Jewish babies b'chol zot. Right. Nevertheless, we're going to make Jewish babies. And because of that kind of hard-headed, I'm being pursued by Egyptian men, and I refuse them, and I choose you, and I actively choose you, and I'm not even gonna, out of the trauma of this pursuit, be just close down my sex life, which would be a totally normal, natural response to what is described in these midrashim. No, instead, they say, I feel confident enough and whole enough and healthy enough in my body and in my sexuality, and I'm going to go out to the field and I'm going to gift you, my downtrodden husband, that same exact thing that I could magically through my righteousness. Like there's no way to account for this behavior other than extraordinary righteousness. And that righteousness is truly, in my opinion, compounded by just like imagining this fuller world of what Egypt was trying to do to them and their bodies. And we see the Midrash imagining, like really just like stating sort of really explicitly what we should have imagined, like what should have happened in Egypt. So this Midrash is Bamidbar Rabbah, and it's on Sota. and and the sota water is taken in water from the laver, and they explain, the Midrash understands that the laver is made from the mirrors of those nashim tzidkaniot, those righteous women who went out into the fields. They had spent all day running away from these men, pursuing them and harassing them and trying to rape them, and then they go out into the fields and they make Jewish babies with their husbands, and that the kior, the laver, is made out of the mirror of those women. Um, and so then you take the water for the sota ritual from the kior that exemplifies those women. So Tam Nashim Shamru Elokim Me'id Aleinu Sheyatzanu Torah Mitzrayim. And the mirrors are taken from those women who said, God bears witness for us that we succeeded, that we avoided the type of persecution that they were trying to put upon us, that we were able to run away, not only preserve our sexuality from the horrors that Egypt was trying to perpetrate against us, but retain our self-love enough to be able to perpetuate the Jewish people, right? There's really two things that happen there. It's both that we were able to fight off the lewd Egyptians, and that we were able to then also be sufficiently like not traumatized by that they were able to perpetuate the Jewish people and to go out into the fields and actually sort of take the upper hand in their sex lives with their own husbands. And that's why, right? Was Israel not redeemed from Egypt purely as a reward for this mitzvah, that these women were able to fight off the Egyptians, that they were able to protect themselves, and that they didn't give into it even under extraordinary persecution. Okay. So then the Midrash goes on to say, "V'chinat motzeh kol hanisim she'asa Elokim leYisrael b'Mitzrayim lo asa ela al sheshabaru atzman min ha'erva." So then this is a very long Midrash, and I only brought you a piece of it. You likewise find that all the miracles which God had brought for Israel in Egypt were wrought solely on account of their having kept themselves from immorality. And here we really mean immorality broadly, as you would see if you open up the whole Midrash. But one of the miracles that happens is the quails, right? So they brought quails from the sea, something that had never happened to anyone else in the whole world. And the other nations hear about it, and they say, who is she that looks forth as the dawn? Amrulaham banav shel Elokim. And they were told, right, the other nations see this miracle of the quails, and they say, who are these people? Why is this happening to them? And the answer that they get is, these are the children of God. And then the people respond to them saying, they can't be the children of God. Enan b'nei Mitzrim. Aren't they just the children of Egyptians? They're not the children of God. They're the children of Egyptians. Why would you say they're the children of Egyptians? Because the assumption of that asker is that every woman in Egypt who got pregnant had been raped, and that every child born to her was the child of an Egyptian. The Midrash imagines this into the brain of every single Gentile on earth. They see the Jews and they say, those are the raped children. Those are the children of Egyptian rape. They are the children of Egyptians. Lo kashim sheshiyavadu mitzrayim bascharim lo kach shividu banashim. Were not the women enslaved in Egypt just as the males were enslaved? Meaning, males, what is male slavery? They're building stuff. What is women's slavery? What's the foundational assumption that one should have when women are enslaved? The foundational assumption is that those women are being raped. That is the assumption that this Midrash puts into the mouth of umot ha'olam, of the people of the world, when they are looking out at the Jews in the desert. Who are the Jews in the desert? They are the children of Jewish women raped by Egyptian men. That is the assumption this Midrash puts into the minds and mouth of the people of the world. And then immediately, straight away, the divine communication swept down to Moses, saying, Maneh et banai ve'edu shebanim banei avotehem. Count my children and know that they are the sons of their fathers, i.e., right? Sometimes as women, we read all of these, we read all of this man was the father, had this many sons, and this man had this many sons, and here are their names, right? Over and over and over again. And the Chumash, and it feels so like annoying, like weren't there women? Why don't they matter? And it says the Midrash here, no, there were women. They do matter. The fact that these fathers are successfully actually the fathers of these sons is a miracle, is astonishing. What that amounts to is that these women, these enslaved women, managed to have Jewish babies, the sons of Jewish fathers. That is, you should be floored by the fact that that happened. And every single time the Torah tells you this person is the eldest son of this other person, that is a miracle, and that can be owed to the righteous women of Egypt who successfully, presumably with violence, that doesn't get said anywhere, but it just seems implied, with violence fought off their Egyptian oppressors who wanted their children, who wanted to make the children of these Jewish women their own. That is the assumption of this Midrash. And then when we start to read, here's just another telling of that same Midrash we saw before about these women going into the field and seducing their husbands, but Jewish women going into the field and seducing their husbands, but it just adds in a little bit more detail. And it adds in this detail of them using the mirrors, right? The women would, while the men were eating and drinking, the women would take out their mirrors and glance into them with their husbands. They look at the mirrors together and they would say, I am more attractive than you. It's such a weird thing to say. Why are these women saying, I am more attractive than you? But actually, the strength of these women to be able to look into the mirror after, you can imagine, they're wet nursing in the Egyptian men's homes. They're doing hard work under Egyptian overseers. They're around these strong Egyptian men all day long we're supposed to imagine, we're supposed to just assume that those people were trying to rape them all day long. They spent their whole days not only accomplishing all the tasks they had to accomplish, but fighting off these men. And they can still go out, they can look in a mirror with their husband and they can say, I'm so hot. And like, that's actually amazing. It's just like we tell these stories about the Nashim Sikaniot and about the righteous women of Egypt. And when we add in the level of awareness that I think our current situation with these women in Gaza who are presumably lacking in some of the freedoms that women slaves in Egypt had, such that they were able to fight off their lewd oppressors. And we know that the situation in Gaza is so much worse than the situation of slavery in Egypt was. Just the mere fact that the Jewish people left Egypt and missed it. Wow, they had such good fish there. There were so many nice watermelons. Nobody's leaving Gaza and remembering the fish and the watermelons. And we know that it's so much worse for Jews who are enslaved today and for Jewish women who are enslaved today. But we can read into the Exodus actually this incredible miracle that happened to our foremothers, that they were able to fight off that lewdness and they were able to also find dignity and wholeness and overcome the trauma even of that aggression that was within themselves. And we can just hope that for the women who escaped Hamas and for the women who are currently being oppressed by them, that someday they will find freedom and that they will be able to fight off the trauma that these people are inflicting upon them, and someday be able to also go back to their spouses and live normal lives the way our matriarchs were in the desert. And it's just such a dream and such a miracle. And when we remember that miracle, we can pray for it to manifest again for our sisters today. But we can only have that realization if we're willing to talk about it and we're willing to be real about it and to remember these texts. And so I would say, just as like, and I'll have 5 minutes of questions at the end. But I'll just say, it's hard if you have children at your Seder. I don't know that this is like a story that you're telling, but to kind of nod at the unique experience of female slavery then and then also today. Something I've been kind of suggesting to people is to put a mirror on your Seder plate or on your Seder table as a nod to the really miraculously strong women in our past, and with hopes that women today can find and be granted that same strength.
Thank you, Rabbanit Sarah. Thank you for just adding a different dimension, I think, to the story, one that I know I had not considered, but will probably never be able to look at the story the same way. Yeah, and so thank you for that and for your Torah.